Welcome back to Have You Heard, the social media podcast by the Social Shepherds. I'm Jack Shepherd, and I have joined with me
Joey.
Sorry, you thought I was going to intro
I thought you were going to intro
mate.
me there. That's fine.
That's right.
So hi everyone, I'm Joey. I'm Senior Paid Media Director here at the Social Shepherd. A few of you have probably seen myself before. But yeah, we're going to be talking about paid media side of things today. And I think we're going to be talking about attribution and
indeed.
What's kind of the best practice for that.
It's always a big topic, one that always gets brought up in new business calls. It's a question we want to ask where how they view it, I guess, is important to how we can then approach it from our side and in terms of our sort of, campaign strategy overall. But I guess, Joey, like from the brands that you're working with and seeing, what are the brands that are sort of scaling fastest, growing the most? How are they sort of viewing it internally, and why is that important that they are viewing it that way?
I mean, attribution is a fun discussion in itself because it can give you so many different layers of visibility in terms of what's performing and what's not. I think quite a lot of the brands and some of the brands that we do speak to, particularly at that new business stage, it's very easy to get stuck into one particular attribution model or attribution window, and it doesn't really give you much full visibility of actually what your activity is driving. So I think the main one that we really see in it is always that meta attribution window, which is 7-day click, 1-day view, which is kind of the base window that you kind of get presented with when you're running activity on the platform. Now, on the grand scheme of things, it's quite a grey attribution window because anyone who clicks within 7 days of after interacting with an ad within a click going through to the site, or within 1 day of viewing, Meta is going to count that as a conversion. Whereas if you look at Google Ads, for example, you're mostly looking at kind of last click based attribution from that perspective. So what you can have is instances of kind of overlapping conversions that are pulling through. Meta's counting it as a conversion. Google's counting it as a conversion. And we've had conversations with clients where they're confused by the attribution model in Meta, and they try and add up all of the revenue that's being generated in Meta and then add up all the revenue that's been generated from Google. Obviously get a massively inflated number because that's not the direct revenue that obviously Meta is driven, and they're trying to compare that with Google Analytics. You're never going to match that up with those attribution windows. So I think from our perspective, we kind of view it in three ways, and that kind of in-platform data does have its place and its time, certainly when you're looking at optimizing data. But there's kind of three layers that we look at it. One is that in-platform data. So how do we view performance from particularly the paid social channels where you've got those longer attribution windows? I think the way that we look at it is the revenue that's coming from those channels and reported is contributed revenue, not generated revenue. That way that you can definitely separate that from that generated revenue piece. But certainly the data that we're looking at within the in-platform side of things, clicks, impressions, click-through rate, CPMs, all of that kind of stuff, the pre-conversion based data is all really, really valuable. So that's all worth looking at from that perspective. The second way that we're looking at it is looking at Google Analytics data. Now, GA4 is obviously the main platform to do so now since Universal's been sunsetted. And we're looking at data-driven attribution model from that perspective. So essentially what Google's doing here is modeling out conversions based on the touch points that users have had on different points of their journey, and kind of gives those different touch points a weighting towards the final conversion that gets generated. Now that's a really, really good way to view performance, obviously, particularly from the Google Ads side of things, because of the type of platform that it is. Users are in a very high intent stage of their user journey. So the likelihood that someone's going to purchase directly off the back end of a click from a Google Ads ad is very, very high. So it's very easy to track revenue from that perspective. But I think one of the things that we've noticed, certainly with the introduction with ASC campaigns on the Meta side of things, is that last click or data-driven attribution revenue that's been reported in Google Analytics from Meta is much easier to achieve now. Those particular campaigns are a really strong way of generating that higher last click or direct data-driven attribution revenue within Google Analytics. The thing with Google Analytics as well is you can always look at all your on-site metrics too. So you're looking at user interaction rates on certain pages, what your bounce rates are, what your engagement rates, and you can start benchmarking performance off the back of that too. So that's two layers of data that we're looking at from that perspective. The third one, which I know we've discussed on several podcasts before, is the blended ROAS approach.
Yeah.
Which is looking at your total media spend input and then your total site revenue output. And essentially what we're doing from this perspective is taking into account all of the marketing activity that's going on the website and the total contribution that's giving to the bottom line, essentially. Because at the end of the day, there's still going to be stuff outside of those two attribution windows that we've spoken about that's not necessarily going to be reported or contributed towards.
Yeah.
So having that holistic view across the whole total website is really good for kind of painting, that wider picture of overall performance. And I think using those three different kind of attribution windows is for sure how we've seen kind of the best scaling with clients. And I think it gives you then the flexibility to be able to move your budgets around freely because you're not pigeonholed in one certain area. I think the clients that we generally tend to see struggling to scale the most is when they have an assigned budget per platform, and then you're stuck in the attribution window of that platform, and then you just can't flex then to where the actual performance is being driven from. So that is the reason that we kind of like to leave things open and like to have the kind of that holistic view, to have that flexibility for us to be able to drive the performance where it's kind of required, really.
I think sometimes it also depends what type of business. We know like a lot of D2C brands, paid media is like 90% of their marketing activity, especially, in those early days, but also scale up days. They're not doing too much influence. They might be dabbling. They're not doing any out of home or anything out, offline. They're really going hard on sort of media spend. And we know that because we've spoken to people where 40% of our costs as a business are in media spend on Google, on Meta. So I think that sort of blended approach, especially for those types of brands, is, blended makes the most sense by far and large. But I guess you take into consideration in-platform results to guide decisions and optimizations from there, especially in terms of like creative and areas like that. But I guess for brands that are like much larger, might have, stores themselves as well as an e-com site, but we might be focusing on driving revenue to their e-com site as a whole in terms of our media spend. Is it better sort of shift, because there's so many inputs, like you said, on those types of brands? Is it better to move away from the blended model on that and then maybe go actually more data driven within GA to account for all of those touch points, would you say?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it really depends on the client itself and obviously the product or service that they're offering. I think typically some of the brands that we work with, like in the fashion space, for example, it's very much an impulsive direct kind of purchase off the back of when you see an ad. It's a lot easier to track what's going on from that perspective. So narrowing your attribution windows is easier when you're kind of working brands where the purchase journey for users is much shorter. Where that becomes more difficult is when you've got, particularly in the homeware space or anything that's got a high average order value, really, which users are having a much longer consideration period before making that purchase.
Sure.
It's then more difficult to be able to kind of map those results, especially when you're looking at the data-driven attribution model in Google Analytics. It's not going to pick up everything that's coming through in terms of attributing that to where all of those different touch points came from. So I think in those instances, I think it's still really important to kind of keep that broader view, because at the end of the day, say, you get advertised on Meta, a sofa, for example, it costs $4,000. Yeah. You're not going to buy it there and then.
Go in store. Perhaps,
exactly. You might go in store. That the likelihood is you might come back round 2, 3, 4 months later once you've saved a bit of cash, and then you go direct to the website or you go via an organic link. And again, that attribution piece then doesn't marry up in terms of all of those initial touch points that you've had. So again, that broader blended view kind of becomes more important when you're working with that kind of longer user journey.
Then you can even look at sort of incremental uplift in in-store revenue as well, and take offline revenue as a part of that. There's obviously some bits you can do in trying to bring offline revenue into attribution of sort of paid media spend, but it is tricky, especially things don't always match up.
Tracking bricks and mortar revenue, specifically when you're running digital activity, is a hard task, really. You've got Google location-based targeting that you can run local ads for and measure the uplift of footfall to stores based on people's location. But outside of that, in terms of revenue, what you've got to do, as you said, is kind of look at that incremental piece. How many customers are you getting to bricks and mortar, and how many sales are you getting off the back end of it from that too? So again, it's looking at it from a broader perspective to understand kind of the wider performance that's being driven.
So I guess for people to take away from this sort of podcast here, I guess we're saying the blended model, or we hear sometimes it called like MER or reference in different ways, but that is definitely something a lot of brands need to be considering, because like you said, we hear often we only care about last click, and you're like, there's so much more to it than last click.
Yeah, absolutely. The blended piece, I think, is just the key to any flexible scaling of budget. If you're a brand that wants to view performance in a sense that you can essentially keep spending as long as the performance is there, that blended model is a complete must that you have to kind of abide by, because at the end of the day, a large proportion of your marketing activity is realistically going to come from the paid side of things. You're probably going to have things outside of that. Your email marketing, you probably have a bit of SEO to increase your organic rankings. You might have some affiliates activity going on, but at the core of it, paid is going to be driving the vast amount of volume there. So that blended model really comes in. And we work with some clients where, particularly, if on days of the week where emails go out, that that there's going to be a spike in revenue on those days, because naturally people are then going to be converting directly off the back of the email, or they'll come through a brand ad, or they'll go directly to the website to kind of pick up any offer or anything that's kind of been presented in that email. So there's slight nuances and adjustments you have to make to it, but on the whole, over like a 4-week period on a monthly basis, it's definitely the best way to run things.
Perfect. Well, thanks very much, Joey. And like I always say, I'm sure we'll have many more ahead of us in terms of these paid podcasts. And thank you very much for watching, everyone. And make sure to subscribe wherever you are, YouTube, Spotify, anywhere. Make sure to subscribe, and we'll see you very, very soon.
Thanks very much.